Web3 focused fund. We started investing in 2017. And in terms of investment strategies and the way we work, we use funds of funds, direct investments, as well as incubating projects. Super excited to be here today, hosting this panel focused on earth renovation, loans, and projects. And so in terms of how we're going to format this panel discussions, I'm going to have the guests introduce themselves shortly, and we will dive in with any questions. I'll leave the last maybe 5 to 10 minutes for any questions for folks online or in the audience. So in this panel, we have Alex from Shima Capital. We have Ilya from Sanctor Capital. We have Dylan from Drive Capital, and we have Kevin, who's with Aves today. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic around for you guys to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about your fund.
I guess the microphone first. So hello, my name is Ilya. Excited to be here. I'm one of the co-founders at Sanctor Capital. We support early stage teams in the Web3 space with a particular focus in metaverse and gaming. Very hands-on, very supportive, founder first.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Lynn. I'm the head of research on the investment team at Shima Capital. We're an early stage crypto native fund focused on pre-seed and seed investments across all the different networks. So we're chain agnostic, vertical agnostic, and stack agnostic. So looking at the application layer level, everything from the gaming, consumer, DAO side, social, all the way down to the processing layer, middleware, infrastructure, data layer.
Hi, I'm Dylan. I'm a venture partner with Drive Capital, a relatively large Web2 and Web3 fund. We've about 400 million in AUM, several unicorns in the Web3 space as well, major board, Bitmain, Deer as well, and then also chain agnostic, etc. So, yeah, always interested in hearing pitch from everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Valentine. I'm with Aves Lair as a venture partner, and I am happy to be here today. Aves Lair is a Web3 focused fund focused on early stage. Founder first. We work very closely to incubate projects as well in terms of verticals, agnostic, sectors agnostic, chains agnostic, and so we are in the midst of launching a ecosystem fund focusing on Aptos and its ecosystem, and we're really excited to be here today.
Awesome, thanks so much. I guess since you guys have the mic, so maybe we can start off here and just make this more kind of conversational. I know we touched a little bit about everyone's kind of investment strategies, but we'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that and talk a little bit about how you guys think about constructing kind of your portfolios in terms of DeFi, gaming, and so forth, and how you guys kind of break it down.
Yeah, so I'll go first. So the way that I think about investing is not actually by different verticals. It's not how I construct a portfolio. I think the way that I do it is actually I have a barometer that I call fair market barometer, and I see if I believe something flourishes in a fair market, a bull market, or both, and then I actually deploy accordingly. And I think that that's to balance the portfolio so that in really steep fair markets like we're seeing right now, you do still have some winners, and that's a lot more also in line with traditional portfolio theory. So,
I think our approach is slightly different in terms of thinking about verticals. I would say that I definitely agree that you look at the opportunity, think about whether or not there's some sustainability in the team, the project, etc. But I can to think about what's the time frame for the opportunities around the verticals. I think that DeFi, NFTs, and sort of the metaverse all have different opportunity time frames, and investing in those time frames, really thinking about how do you identify what opportunities are most likely to sort of hit first, and then build out a portfolio around what you want exposure to, and how do you think about upside, and actually time to sort of like market in terms of like what that opportunity is. So what's the likelihood that there will be a bunch of new users being onboarded into the opportunity and how likely it is and whether the ecosystem is ready to be able to sort of support that growth for that vertical. And so, thinking about all of that, we like to think about, what are those verticals that we'd like to attack first, and position ourselves around the ecosystems that have potential, that maybe are not necessarily ready today, but, will have a lot of potential moving forward over the next, 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, so I think for us, so we look at it in several different ways. I think everyone can agree that crypto, blockchain in and of itself, from a tech perspective, is very modular. Everyone talks about the modularity and composability of the tech, but it happens at the business level as well, right? And so when you think about how one protocol or one project might work, as a building block with other projects, right? Whether it's stablecoins, and how it facilitates and works with DEX, how gaming might work with certain NFTs or marketplaces, right? So we kind of understand the dichotomy or the dynamic that exists, with the space. And so when we think about investments, it's very much acknowledging that there's an opportunity to really create an ecosystem within our own portfolio. And that goes not just within our portfolio, but then also to our LPs and then also within the team itself. And then second, we're pretty crypto native. I think everyone on the team has been in this space for many, many years. And what that has really facilitated is understanding that the objective function, even though we want to be returning 20 for our LPs, is very much we want to push the envelope of innovation in the space. And so what does that mean? It means that when we think about investments, it's not necessarily based off of trends, it's not necessarily based off of theses particularly, but definitely very research-driven, very founder-driven, and also always thinking about what's around the corner, right? So what may be hot now might not be in 2 years. What may be really hot in 2 to 3 years is definitely not hot now. And so always kind of being forward-thinking, because I think that will facilitate actual growth of the ecosystem, and whatever we can do to facilitate that, we'll make proper investments. And then lastly, I think it's very important to kind of be pragmatic about our investment strategies in terms of we really diligence ourselves as much as we diligence projects we look at, in the sense that we definitely want to get very hands-on, very proactive with working with portfolio companies, and if we're not dedicating the right amount of time and rolling up our sleeves like we should be, then that's not a great fit, because we definitely want to play a role and ensure that we're not just another check for companies.
I think for us, we are probably the most focused group here in terms of a particular sector. So given that we focus on metaverse and gaming, we do kind of select projects that fit along that line. But for us, metaverse and gaming is more of a vertical. So we look at games and that as just kind of one of the slices. So there's a lot of things that need to be there and be built and functioning for games in the metaverse to exist as we envision it, right? So we look at investing along both the infrastructure segment, the creator segment, because we do, metaverse is a digital universe, right? Everything's content. Then there are obviously games, and then there's a whole section of tooling that we envision, and that includes financials, that includes distribution. There's kind of a whole lot of things that need to happen for the game to get to the gamer and the gamer to enjoy that experience. And we do try to see, as our portfolio grows, kind of the challenges that our founders are facing, right? Because that is kind of the next step of innovation, right? Because we see kind of the space evolving in front of our eyes. And so we do seek to kind of harness synergies within our portfolio, given how our focus allows us to kind of build out this vertical. One thing I'd like to piggyback up, it is important to be able to kind of diligence yourself and be able to understand kind of where you are able to help, and what is it that we can bring in as partners, as analysts, and also kind of as our portfolio as a whole, right? And being able to position yourself for that next term of the portfolio as a whole.
No, thanks. That was really, really insightful. So I guess, kind of talking about ecosystems, right, and direct investment in different projects. Love to hear a little bit more about how you guys think of deal structuring, right, when it comes to kind of funds, how you guys think about deal structuring when it's kind of investing in a whole ecosystem, how do you guys choose to invest in different kind of applications within the ecosystem, and how do you guys mitigate risk around that?
Yes, I started the other way around. So I think, obviously, none of this is financial advice, but one thing I would like to say, especially kind of as we're looking at deals right now, is understanding value accrual. There's a lot of different instruments floating around. There's safes, there's stats, your equity, there's kind of all sorts of different combinations. And the one thing that's important is to make sure there's alignment between kind of the founder team, the investors, the ecosystem. That's something that we look at very closely. We're comfortable kind of deploying into various different instruments, but set up in a way where we can go into liquid assets, we can go into the primary, secondary, we can invest into NFTs. But it's important that there's value alignment and that we understand very precisely where value is going to accrue as the system grows, right? Because the terms utility token, governance token can be used very loosely, and that can become very dangerous, right? We always think about as early stage investors, we want to protect the founders, but it's also our fiduciary responsibility to protect ourselves and the LPs. And from that perspective, right, we try to right now make sure that we have exposure to all of the kind of value component, right? So if there's token and equity, right, we need to have usually exposure to both, right? If there's a token round, if there's an early equity round, right, we need to understand DLSC smiles. This is a common issue for people. But yeah, I think that's one of the key things we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I really don't have anything else to add to that. Equity token exposure. I would say the majority of our fund is token. So there is a plan for a token, so coming in the form of a warrant or a side letter. But obviously, if there is any opportunity for them to be acquired, having equity is and having exposure to those is nice. I think your point about value is absolutely critical. Specifically at Shima, we only focus on the liquid investments, and so we don't really touch secondary market tokens as much as it was very attractive to do so a few months ago. We had to stay away with them.
I think it's interesting the conversation we can have about if value accrues to the token or to the equity when there is equity and token. I think there is this generalized consensus among investors that the value tends to accrue to the token, which is why we kind of prefer a token, and we prefer liquidity. I think what we are seeing now, though, is the issue with the hyper-liquidity in the markets, where if people can take profit they have, especially in times of fear or FUD, as it's called. And so I think now I'm almost trying to revise my thoughts about being token first, because markets can almost be more hidden when it's all equity and you have to do certain types of financing versus others. And I agree that secondary tokens in a market like this are very dangerous, and that's really for the traders, not the VCs. And they're good well. So yeah.
I think that everyone has touched on something really sort of interesting here. I think the value alignment comment, I think, is the most important. I think you want the founders to have as much skin in the game and making sure that they're going to develop the thing and that it's not a cash grab. And that they're not just thinking about the token, the price, and the exit. To sort of your point, and we've seen quite a few companies that are, if you take a look at, Dapper Labs or OpenSea or any of these companies that, had equity investments and don't have tokens, they've done really well for themselves if you were to invest in these founders. And so just really thinking about, sort of like some of that upside around opportunity. But there's also a question around sort of like, since the tech is new and burgeoning, how do you think about investing in the founder and, the founders putting their faith in the tech And you know, you have to put your faith in the founder, and there's sort of like this dynamic of things moving at the same time. So how do you mitigate that risk? And I think that, you know, some of what you can do is also sort of like milestone driven as well. And really focusing on KPIs, you know, whatever those are that have been agreed upon, and really trying to, you know, have this relationship with the founder that is, you know, somewhat, you know, guaranteed based on, you know, what milestones have been made. There have been ecosystem funds that have been investing in companies with tokens, the native token of the ecosystem, and that's just, I think, really a poor way to, you know, have value aligned, because, you know, founders need certainty around cash, and tokens are highly volatile, and we've seen, you know, investments into companies that have been token-based, like, go down very quickly. In some cases, you know, dropping by 90%, and then, you know, your founders in this place where they can't execute on the startup that, you know, the idea that they envisioned. So I think it's a balance of really trying to figure out how you go about, you know, aligning value, mitigating some of that downside risk, but giving the team just enough incentive to be able to know that, you know, we got your back, we're going to do what we can, but let's think about, you know, how do we all sort of march and navigate through this together in a way that makes sense for all parties involved.
Sorry, we were actually just talking about this in the back room, where we were talking about the way ecosystems are deploying capital and how it's changed. And so I think that that's interesting, because there are certain ecosystems that have been not necessarily announcing, but telling people that they're not going to be giving the token in grants anymore. So like Cell is an example of that recently. And so I also know that their foundation has been relatively active, but not necessarily their ecosystem fund. And that's also confusing in situations where there are both. And so just trying to figure out how the ecosystems interact in a biz dev pipeline, how they fund a lot of the projects, and why and when and who's actually making those decisions is very murky, but in times like these also becomes much harder, because there is less capital to deploy on that end.
I think that's a great kind of transition into the question that I had around kind of what roles should these foundations play, and what, you know, the roles for these kind of grant organizations play, especially in kind of new ecosystems that are being built, and how, you know, whether it's incentives for developers to build, how do you guys think about that in terms of how much they should be kind of involved, and what kind of initiatives do you guys think that, you know, should happen?
Yeah, so I think that there's obviously a role for, you know, foundations and grant-making organizations. I think one thing to think about what role they want to play around at first building out the developer experience, first and foremost. And, you know, I think about the Ethereum Foundation and their support around, you know, Geth, and, you know, what they did initially with, you know, MetaMask, and really supporting developers to be incentivized to, you know, do the improvement proposals that allow for what we now have today. But I think it needs to be very distinct in terms of like that line between, you know, well, this is what the foundation is going to do, and this is a perhaps grant-making organization, and then there's what the ecosystem funding will do. And I think they have to sort of like, you know, be speaking in tandem, because I think that, you know, initially, if we take a look at like what Consensus and the Ethereum Foundation did, was essentially, you know, sort of like help Consensus mitigate the risk around funding, you know, MetaMask and Infura, et cetera, right? And all of that sort of critical infrastructure that developers would need to be able to go out and have an experience that is analogous to, you know, saying, I want to build a web app. AWS exists, right? If we want to think about Infura or whatever the case may be, or QuickNode, or you know, what's appropriate, right? So I think that there has to be sort of like this coordination, and I think you have to staff the foundation with individuals who understand go-to-market and biz dev, and being able to build out a pipeline and understanding developer marketing, which I think Microsoft and AWS and Google are really, really great at.
So something you kind of touched on though is, I think a great model for like how to deploy grants is like right now the Optimism Foundation actually deployed $40 million worth of grants within like an 8-week period this summer. They've been very aggressive, but they have a full-time head of governance who's really brilliant and talented who actually does that. And her job is to make sure that incentives are aligned and that there's tacit regulation that the foundation has to make sure people don't get the grant and then pay themselves, which has happened before, right? So just making sure that there's almost like a quasi-internal regulation and regulatory person or body is very, very important. I think developer incentives is like a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and I think there's certain ecosystems that are really banking on that, like Agoric, really fascinating. But yeah, I'm really interested in that as well. And I think like that's the question, one of the big questions for our industry moving forward.
I guess I just have one comment to make, which is they absolutely do play a role, of course, in a number of facets. I think from the liquidity side, I think there was a VC who said that funds or VC firms are selling rocket fuel, and not all startups are rockets. And there's a huge opportunity for growth within a space to address, organizations or projects that might not necessarily get the opportunity to receive the capital from firms, but from grants and foundations, they have that exposure. And I think this is very prevalent in Web 2, and a lot of different funding models have come out of that, right? Like rev share or venture debt, right? And not just equity SAFs or safes, excuse me. And I think that applies very similarly in Web 3. And I think foundations and ecosystem funds play a really big role in that to address the market and all the projects that want to build, and not just kind of necessarily what other investors or capital allocators are looking at.
I guess what I'd like to add is that there's a temptation to kind of solve a lot of things with money, and there's a number of foundations that are very well capitalized. Ooh, gets louder. So there's a lot of support that teams are looking for that has nothing to do with money. And we see that, for instance, with the gaming space, teams can raise, there's money about, but they need to think through about how to go from, Web 2 to Web 3, how to think about their payments, how to think about their, onboarding, how to think about publishing stack. There's a lot of these things that, they need help thinking through from somebody who has experience in the Web 3 space. And a lot of times you look to the foundation for that. You also look to the foundation for leadership, right? Because you want to understand the direction. Especially when startup teams are trying to think, I'm trying to build a gaming project. Where do I go? What does that ecosystem offer me? And a lot of that time, you want the foundational leadership to kind of align directions and align different parties and kind of act more as a project manager rather than kind of the head investor there. Because they are around the ecosystem, there's going to be good investors. And so I don't want to discount the value of the capital that's being brought into the system, but we see the temptation to try to solve all of the problems by doling out grants, and that's not always what's needed, and that's not always the best solution.
I think it works. I'm just speaking really lightly. So I think, in terms of kind of us being here, obviously this is kind of a kickoff for the Aptos Hackathon as well. So I think a lot of folks maybe in the audience or folks online are probably also really curious in terms of kind of as a VC when you're looking at a new ecosystem being built and a new L1 kind of coming out, how do you guys think about kind of evaluating projects that are being built on this new ecosystem, right? There's a lot of folks saying that potentially it's kind of duplicating what's already existing on other chains, and there's also folks that are saying that, you know, there is kind of new, deeper technologies behind these new chains, so there can be new cases or new kind of focuses on these new L1. So just really curious, kind of you guys' thoughts on first evaluating kind of new chains and new projects being built on that, and then second part in terms of, and we kind of discussed this in the back room as well, where maybe potentially that for different chains, there's different focuses that they can help bring out in these different projects.
I guess we'll go back either way. I think there's a few things. One, we try to evaluate the technical merit of whatever, infrastructure is coming out, right? And you need to understand, one, are they able to deliver what it is that they're promising? Is what they're promising actually needed? Does it solve an actual need? I think for a bit of time, there was a little bit of skepticism around, do we need all of these new L1s? But I think at least from our perspective within the metaverse and gaming space, we see that a single game can make the life of a chain. And so any chain right now still has the opportunity to build a vibrant ecosystem. So if there is something that they're offering and they have a plan and they have the team to execute, we think everybody still has a chance right now. So we validate that part of it. On the other side of it, because we're very early stage, we tend to look at where developers go. We try to be kind of active around hackathons, not even so much because, projects there are really kind of raw and rough stage, but at the same time, we get to see what developers are thinking and what challenges they face. And ultimately, you get to see which ecosystem is going to have the highest chance around where are developers really excited about building things. And I think that's kind of your canary, right? Your earliest sign. I remember, certain hackathons where I was like, the ecosystem had a lot of doubt, but developers were excited, right? And you're not going to hear a lot about kind of developer excitement in the media. It's not the most exciting topic to write about, but if you see that gives you a chance. And you have to understand also that a lot of the kind of really vital, critical projects around an ecosystem take a long time to deliver, right? As an example, a really strong game has a 2 to 4 year development cycle, right? So if there's a new ecosystem and they start having games being built on it, right? Like you're not going to see that game for quite some time. And so you need to understand, you need to be patient with them as well, right? And understand where there's a foundation as opposed to kind of expecting results from tomorrow.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours because I think it's very important for any, particularly application layer protocols building on the layer 1 or layer 2, I guess more network layer projects such as Aptos to really understand the viability of the network itself. And so whenever we see a new project, we're always, as an investment criteria, really digging into the underlying ecosystem of not just the project itself, but everything in between, right? Like what oracles are involved, do they even have an oracle? And what are the risks and mitigants that are involved if the layer 1 fails, right? Are they able to pivot because they've built their smart contracts in EVM, so they can go from one EVM chain to another if that particular one they work with fails? I think everyone can look to the Terra ecosystem breaking down, and there was this huge BD play from all the other chains to attract the talent from the projects that were building on Terra. But so from our perspective, and we're very lucky to have a CTO and investment partner, Carl Hua, who built the layer 1 back in 2019, and he sold it to Ripple. And so he led the DeFi team at Ripple, and so he has hands-on experience building the layer 1 and knows exactly what it is to look for. And so I think that just, as I mentioned to my earlier point, very research-driven when we look at layer 1s and the types of applications building on top. And I think that there are also specific use cases, right? So I guess to your second part of the question, Aptos is a great example, or any Move ecosystem, Mist Labs as well, Smartcoin and Celo, for instance. All of them have this opportunity now to leverage Move's features of building around the idea of scarcity and assets natively. And so I won't go into all of that, but that's really, really powerful, both from a safety perspective and security perspective, and just honestly, like really dialing in and accessing the primitives and new primitives and this new paradigm of crypto, and not really falling into this Web 2.5 thing that we've been seeing so long, which really results in a lot of this commentary around grifty projects only going to certain chains because they can make a quick buck or Ponzi schemes.
I think, and something that we kind of came to the consensus in the background about was that, it's like we spoke for about 30, 40 minutes before, but is that, the tech is so interesting on the L1 side, right? There's new innovation, but brand and community are just as important. And the tech leads to the brand in some ways, and in some ways it doesn't. I'll give you an example. So, I think when Celo first came out, it was seen as relatively novel, some of the technology, some of the cross-chain architecture, et cetera. But it's really known as a blockchain for social good, and a blockchain for emerging markets. And so I've never met anyone that is concerned with the underlying tech or is even necessarily as aware. I do think the push move is very smart. I think it makes everything happening more secure, but definitely that chain was not part of the DeFi summer, part of the DeFi craze. They almost missed out, as it were, right? So to me, I think brand is so important because it leads to people actually using the chain. And I think that most people are not cogent to the underlying technology unless they're building the application themselves. And sometimes even when they are and they experience obstacles, continue to do so because of brand. So Flow and Dapper Labs are a great example of that, where there, to be frank, are deep technological issues, and then people build on it anyways because it does have this brand. And so, for me, I'm much more interested in L1s that are coming out that have a very specific silo or almost thesis in the way that funds do, right? So to me, there's a huge dearth of funds in this space that focus on what I believe is one of the greatest applications of crypto, and we actually spoke about this too, which is emerging markets, remittances, and sending payments in places that aren't the US or Europe. So if that's the case, then I think there should just be more and more chains that cater to that specific kind of audience. And you could argue that Cardano has a huge African presence. Topple and L1 for social good also has a presence in emerging markets. And so for me, I'm so bullish on those kind of chains. And we could have hours-long discussions about the tech between the other chains, and we will. Those are my 2 cents.
I think there is merit in everything that was said. All opinions matter, right? But I guess from your perspective, I think what's going to attract developers. It's going to be what's the use case? Well, how does this solve some problem for me in a really interesting way? And I think there are different character personas of developers, right? JavaScript developers are different than Rust developers and Haskell developers, right? And I think that the latter are the ones that are Cardano and the Move ecosystem are probably targeting. There's a reason why that you can have more safety and more security based on that, right? And so I think that that drives then the new use cases, right? Now, how you choose as a developer, what community and brand you end up joining, I think depends on your own personal convictions and where you see opportunities. And so I think that it's really important to think about what these new use cases can be. If blockchains are going to be, transacting in value, it's going to be the internet of value, then I think that that value has to be secure. And, applications, that are out today, that are okay with, bridges being hacked or, key management issues, that's not going to fly for the general consumer. I mean, I think for the most part, people feel hurt when those things happen and people do lose a lot of money. But I think that, generally, we kind of like, dust ourselves off and move on because we're like in the bubble. Speaking about that use case that we were talking about, my parents are immigrants and and just thinking about PM specifically, when it was announced, I thought that it was a great use case in WhatsApp because it is so difficult for my parents to send money back to Jamaica to pay for whatever needs to be paid for, whether that's to send money to family or to pay for taxes or whatever the case may be. And WhatsApp was the user interface that was going to be attached to a blockchain that was going to move forward, I think, billions of users. And to know that, that money was going to be safe and secure and, cheaper than sending it to a money transmitter, I think is a huge step forward. So I think that we probably need to think about both ends of the spectrum around community and how you get developers excited and people want to build applications. But I think it goes back to developer outreach and how you onboard those developer personas that are really interested in the language itself and what that language does and what it solves for, so that we can get to those use cases that are novel.
But on that same token, right, like a lot of people, so I know a lot of founders that love Cosmos, right, because they love Golang and they love, but I think they stay for the founding team and the community and the brand, and I think that it is a very nuanced kind of experience working with an L1, and it's not any one thing. Yeah.
So I have one more question for our panelists, and then would open it up to the audience for any questions you guys have. But I guess kind of with everything everyone's seeing now, I know Alex mentioned, she was really focused on kind of research versus having a thesis. I'm curious for everyone here in terms of kind of for your funds, with kind of current market conditions, like has your thesis or the way you do research shifted or changed kind of based on current market conditions and how you guys kind of move forward, and if you guys have examples of projects where you invested in. For us personally, we're doing kind of internal review, so looking at projects that did really well and projects that are not doing so well, just kind of thinking through how we do research, invest in thesis, and it's just curious to hear everyone's kind of thoughts here.
Yeah, so I love the way that you frame that too, right? Because I think that there are some people that they have very specific ideas for what they're looking for. And they could almost start their own incubator if they wanted, right? There's some firms that do that. Like Foley's Ventures does this all the time. Like Jason will post on Twitter and say, this is exactly what I want someone to build. And then people will do it. He doesn't even have an incubator. It's really brilliant. And then there are other firms that like to be more nimble and opportunistic. And they like to see something and do a deep dive. And personally, I like to be the former, because I think that it allows you to mull over topics, it allows you to think through things, and but it takes longer and you might miss out on certain opportunities. We were even talking about some opportunities that, we all knew about and how I, just thought, okay, it's a little fast, right? So I think that that's more about temperament than it is necessarily about right or wrong or the way to do things.
Agreed. As it relates to Aptos in particular, I think that it would move on to really be research driven. And going back to the prior question and really just thinking about how do you take advantage of the technical opportunities, And so I think in order to be research driven though, you have to have very research driven thinking as part of the culture, and who the founders are, what their internal capabilities are, the founders of the fund, that is. And so yeah, Paradigm will do that sort of thing all the time, right? We see the Art Gobblers project, and now people are jumping up to build something. But I think you start to think about what problems you'd like to see solved and where there's some opportunities, because founders don't always see it, and you're not always going to get it in your pipeline. And I think that Aves Lair is really focused on research as well. There's a massive team that's really focused on just creating these papers and putting out these proof of concepts and matching them with incubation. So I think that there's an opportunity there as well. But I think being opportunistic is always helpful, and I don't think that there's any one right way. I think it just depends on the team, the culture, and the chain in this case. And I think I'd really like to explore what use cases can be sort of like a bit bigger. I think there's an opportunity to do some enterprise-like opportunities, given the safety and security of the language as well. So there's sort of like this two-sided marketplace of opportunities around something that is very crypto native, as well as enterprise, perhaps consumer focused in terms of onboarding a lot of users.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to further that too, where I think one of the biggest opportunities in the investment space is that people do have tacitly different theses around things, and so alpha is totally alpha. The thought of alpha is something that's totally different per person. Like I might think you have alpha because I agree with your thesis, right? And so then that comes down to also the difference between what's a good deal and a bad deal. And so, something that I've been talking with different firms about is, if you were to galvanize a bunch of scouts, how would you do that? And I think the thing that we realized was that most firms don't publish their theses in a very succinct way. Paradigm famously actually keeps all their DD private from their LPs. They won't send them memos, right? So because so much of this is very secretive, there's so much alpha. Whereas a lot of traditional firms will post very, A16Z will do this on their site, very long, research articles, here's why we did this investment, very long blog posts. But I think that that's what makes crypto exciting. But also is part of the reason that this doesn't happen the way it does in traditional VC is because the space is so fast moving and it's so much more difficult to do so. And so for me, if I were to ever launch a Scout program, the thing that I would do alongside it, which is global coin research is the perfect paradigm for this, is they publish research and then they also have a large community that brings deals and then they invest in them. But they always are interacting, talking about what they think about the deal, and people vote on them. And so I think to galvanize Scouts, you do need to actually have tons of written work about what you think and why it's a good deal, so that people understand what you're looking for, and you can be a lot more precise. And so I actually have dozens of my own writings just about thesis on Solana, thesis on this L1, and how I feel, because then it just makes everything so much more precise and easier, and you can move forward depending on your opinion that you've already done research and thinking on.
Yeah, I think that for us, to your point, right, very research driven, and I think but it's more so kind of pressing where it hurts. I think you have to have a thesis, whether it's more general or specific, to really identify areas that are good opportunities, and then the research is more of a means to an end to ensure that that is something that we really have conviction in. And so it's more of a hybrid model, right? It's a spectrum and not necessarily binary. And there's also the business side, right? The fiduciary duty of us, if we're still a business, that we, in terms of returning capital to our LPs. And for instance, we did not do the Aptos deal because we are a $200 million fund. And what makes sense in terms of our mandate is to invest size into a valuation that was Aptos were missing, right? Or a lot of the elements. It requires a lot of capital to build on L1. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's just how it's been, how it was viewed and how it was valued. But that just did not make any sense for us. As much as I knew that Aptos and Mistin and everything within the ecosystem is a great opportunity, it wasn't something that, as much research as I'm doing, we're targeting applications being built on these ecosystems and not the ecosystems themselves. And that happens all the time, right? Even with applications, right? I think, like Fractal raised 35 million in their seed round. So I think it applies to us.
I think I'll echo that. I think that has to be both, because I think thesis is kind of an output of research, and it has to be continuously updated and evolving. I mean, for us, given our focus, we have to have a thesis, right? And the thesis is also kind of it's a sign of conviction, right? Because we come in on early stage, we expect there's going to be a lot of building, that there's going to be kind of an onboarding process and user development. There has to be a vision there in order to kind of go through the ups and downs and to kind of help give teams confidence, right? Because they'll come to us, and they will look for our vision as well, as part of that ecosystem. And so I think the thesis is important to kind of maintain conviction and maintain a long-term vision. But I think the research is kind of what feeds it a lot of times, right? And again, early stage, you have to do research, right? Because most of the stuff, the exciting stuff, is new and interesting. You have to have an opinion on whether or not it's going to work or not. And you can't do that without research. And so I think both of them kind of go hand in hand. And you can't really, you almost can't have one without the other.
All right, so I think we're gonna, does anyone in the audience have any questions that they're very excited to ask? All right, well, this is a really, really great panel. I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts. I mean, it was great that we ended on research, that was kind of the closing. But yeah, anyone have any kind of last minute thoughts on anything that you'd like to share? All right, well, thank you all so much, and thank you to our panelists, super insightful, and thank you for sharing some of your wisdom.
Thank you.